studies of second language acquisition do an excellent job explaining how we pick up grammar rules and internalize vocabulary. But when it comes to the sounds of a language, those same frameworks often mischaracterize how humans actually acquire a new phonological system. For decades, linguists have debated a surprisingly contentious question. Can second language pronunciation actually be taught to adults, or is it a biological impossibility? The first major barrier to classroom instruction is the critical period hypothesis. This theory asserts that after a certain age, humans are biologically locked out of achieving native-like pronunciation. The second barrier comes from Stephen Krashen's matral approach. Krashen argued that pronunciation is acquired entirely unconsciously. If the brain only absorbs sounds through natural exposure, explicit classroom instruction is useless. However, the data contradicts this biological lockout. Snow and Hoofnagel-Holz's research demonstrated that in the initial stages of learning, adults actually outperform children in sound discrimination. Krashen's argument also relies on incomplete data. Studies concluding that teachers have no impact on pronunciation, like those by Purcell and Suter, only measured learners already living in immersive environments. They ignored the classroom's vital role in providing directed exposure and generating motivation. Pronunciation requires a unique multimodal framework. It operates simultaneously as a motor skill, a cognitive mapping exercise, and a sociolinguistic identity marker. Evidence suggests that adults retain a high capacity for phonetic change. Teaching them effectively requires moving beyond general acquisition models to develop a framework specific to phonology. The base layer of our new model addresses physical motor mechanics. Historically, this has been the domain of audiolingualism, defined by the classic listen and repeat methodology. While rote habit formation is discredited for teaching grammar, it stubbornly persists in commercial pronunciation textbooks. This diagram separates grammar and vocabulary from pronunciation. Phonology is distinct, relying heavily on cognitive processing and fine motor functions. Treating pronunciation as a purely mechanical exercise means controlled motor practice often fails to transfer to spontaneous communication. Standard materials enforce a strict perceptual sequence. They assume auditory perception must always precede oral production, meaning a learner cannot produce a sound they haven't learned to hear first. Empirical studies prove this false. Research by Goto, Leather, and James showed that subjects with poor auditory discrimination could still pronounce target sounds correctly. This diagram illustrates a two-way feedback loop between these functions. Training in one modality improves the other. Feeling the mouth physically move to articulate a sound can actively improve the brain's ability to hear that same sound. Mechanical drills are useful only when they are restructured to recognize this relationship. Perception and production mutually reinforce each other in a continuous physical loop. Moving above physical mechanics brings us to the cognitive processing layer, known as interlanguage phonology. A pervasive myth is that a learner's native language acts as an interference, causing errors. Elaine Tarone's research counters this. Native language transfer accounts for only a minor fraction of variation. The rest is driven by active learning strategies, like overgeneralizing rules or simply avoiding difficult sounds. This graph maps equivalence classification. Gray nodes represent a learner's existing native sound system. Learners naturally mount new sounds onto their existing categories, seeking the closest native equivalents. When similarities fail, the brain reorganizes the network to carve out new space for unfamiliar features. This dynamic reorganization is much more complex than the simplistic, error-focused contrastive analysis found in textbooks. L1 transfer functions as a natural cognitive strategy. Designers can leverage this mapping process to help learners bridge the gap between their native sounds and a new system. The next layer of the model focuses on the monitor, the brain's internal editor, and whether learners should be explicitly taught formal phonetic rules. This visualizes Krashen's concern regarding explicit instruction. He argued that teaching formal phonological rules encourages monitor overuse. This constant internal checking paralyzes the learner and destroys spoken fluency. Empirical research challenges this rigid divide between explicit knowledge and implicit fluency. They observed a process called covert rehearsal. By learning formal rules, learners generate internal phonetic data to feed their acquisition device. The boundary between learning and acquisition is porous, allowing information to transfer between systems through continued use. Formal rules allow for post hoc monitoring. After speaking, learners have the diagnostic tools to consciously assess the accuracy of their own speech. This shifts the burden of correction. Learners transition from relying on external teacher feedback to relying on their own internal kinesthetic awareness. Explicit rule teaching equips learners with the necessary mental architecture to supply their own ideal input and correct themselves in real time. Scaling the model up from cognitive mechanics brings us to the macro environment, actual human communication. A major flaw in modern pronunciation materials is their widespread reliance on decontextualized, isolated words and artificial dialogues that require no real comprehension. This waveform represents pronunciation practice operating in a void. When articulation is divorced from the transmission of actual messages, the practice becomes ineffective. Target sounds must be integrated into broader lexical and grammatical contexts. One method is using phonological information gaps. In these tasks, a listener can only succeed if the speaker correctly perceives and produces specific suprasegmental features like pitch and stress. Materials must be structured around discourse functions, such as highlighting information or referring to past events, rather than just isolated lists of vowels and consonants. Achieving intelligibility requires mastering the articulation of a sound and then precisely correlating that sound to meaning within a linguistic context. This now completes our framework. The mechanical and cognitive systems operate within two final layers, the sociological and the psychological. Sociologically, pronunciation is heavily governed by an individual's value set and sociocultural schemata. The way someone speaks signals the impression they intend to make. This dynamic directly leads to what linguists call L2 social marking. A learner may consciously or subconsciously retain a foreign accent specifically as a marker of in-group affiliation to their native culture. Learners often target a level of pronunciation appropriate for their specific professional needs and sociological environment, rather than pursuing native-like perfection. Psychologically, mastering pronunciation requires conscious outside-in control. An individual's immediate emotional state in any given situation directly alters their phonetic accuracy. Adopting a new phonological system requires developing a second language ego, a process heavily reliant on empathy and psychological readiness. Ultimately, pronunciation is a physical negotiation of identity and emotion, continually shaped by the learner's social affiliation within their environment.